Hey guys, welcome to Code Decode. In this video, we're going to cover top 80 plus Spring Boot interview questions. So let's get started. What is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is just an extension to Spring Framework and it is created for RAD development, that is Rapid Application Development. It provides you with the auto configuration, embedded server facilities and starter dependency on the tabletop for you. And it reduces the boilerplate configurations. How is it different from Spring Framework? The Spring Framework is a core framework, but it requires a lot of manual configurations. And even you have to set up the external servers also because it does not provide you inbuilt server setup like Tomcat.jt. While in the case of Spring Boot, it is already built on top of Spring Framework. So if obviously it is going to add more stuff to Spring Framework to make the things automatic. For example, it provides you auto configuration. It automatically configures all the beans on the path. It embeds the Tomcat, JT or Undertow kind of external servers. By default is a Tomcat one. Also, it provides you the production ready features like Actuator and all those stuffs. Now, what are the advantages of Spring Boot? Spring Boot is for rapid application development. It is going to have the minimal configuration required because most of the configurations are done by Spring Boot on its own by default. For example, if you just add Spring security dependency in your pom.xml in a Spring Boot application, the login page is automatically created for you with no configuration. You just have to add one dependency, login page created out of the box for you. That's the advantage of Spring Boot. It has embedded web servers. It has starter dependencies, for example, for security. It has production ready monitoring systems, and it provides you the easy microservice deployment facilities. Now, what is auto configuration? Auto configuration is just automatically configuring your beans based on the class path dependencies, existing beans, and whatever you define in the application properties. How do you enable it? To enable this auto configuration possibility, there is enable auto configuration annotation. For example, if you want to connect your application to database, you need a ORM, which is a framework between your application and the database. That is JPA for you. To enable the auto configuration of data sources, transaction managers, and entity managers, you just have to add one single dependency in your class path. And that is all. It will add all the dependencies as a bean automatically. So it auto configures those beans. Now, what is Spring Boot application? It is just a combination of Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scans. How does it work internally? The configuration class is responsible for declaring the class as a configuration class. That means any bean that you want to create, you can create wherever this annotation is provided. Auto configuration, as discussed in the previous question, allows you to auto configure beans on the class path. And component scan allows you to scan the root package and all its child sub packages. Search, scan the components and create the beans out of those. So that's component scan. It scans the root and all the subchildrens. Hey guys, so recently we have launched a very new course on Udemy, that is Spring Security 7. So now we have total of 2 courses. One on the Spring Security, second on the full stack application with all the deployment, pipelines, CI/CD, AWS Cloud, Kubernetes, everything. In Spring Security, we have covered authentication, authorization, filter chains, CRAN types, JWTs, OIDCs, SSO, CSRF, CORS, and very important, we have created here also a full stack project with a front end, back end, and security is implemented using Auth 0 and Keycloak. Both of those authorization servers we have defined and created an end-to-end POC in this course. And the next course was on a full stack application where you understand microservices, Angular, JUnits, Docker, Kubernetes, AWS, EKS, RDS, Mongo Atlas, Jenkins, CI/CD, Argo CD, everything. So this makes a complete end-to-end project with front-end, back-end, and security implemented, deployed on the cloud also. Links of both of these courses will be given in the description below. Also, we will try to give some free coupons. Just let us know in the comment section for which course you would need the coupons. We will try to avail the coupons for the courses for free in the next month. Just for a small request, please leave your genuine, honest comments on these courses. That will help us create more such free courses or discounted courses for you guys. What is dependency injection? Dependency injection is a design pattern where dependencies are injected by Spring container rather than you creating the object of that particular class with a new keyword. Rather better, give that responsibility of creating the new object to Spring container, which promotes the loose coupling, and it is done through the help of IOC containers. For example, if you want a user repository, rather than creating with a new keyword as user repository repo equals to new user repository, you do rather what? You just auto wire it, and using this is done through constructor injection. So this is just the auto wiring with the construction injection. So this is how dependency injection is done, using two options, or the auto wired or the construction injection. What are Spring Beans? Spring Beans are nothing but the objects which are managed by the Spring IOC container for you, so that you don't have to create the object with a new keyword. It creates a singleton bean into its own container and provide that singleton bean instance to you, unless you decide that the type of that particular or scope of that has to be something different. So Spring Beans are the objects, nothing else. It's just the objects which are managed by IOC container and provided to you as the managed bean. The whole life cycle of the Spring Bean is managed by a IOC container. You can define a particular class like an employee controller class or service class. You can define them using the different annotations. For example, @component also creates the bean, service creates the bean, repository creates the bean also creates the bean. Now you'd ask me what is the difference between all the four of them if all of them creates the bean. So @bean auto, you understand it creates the bean. Now, why all the three also creates the bean is because they have different reading purposes and different logical places where you can use these annotations. But at the end, trust me, all of the four, the task of them is to create a bean in the IOC container. That's it. The component is a generic bean created. The service is a business logic layer bean to be created. For example, wherever your business logic or the requirements are created, that, like for example, there is some business requirement that if you're an employee of XYZ organization, you should not have 2 PAN cards or 2 other cards or something like that. Those simple kind of validations or the business logic layers should be present in the @service class. While the repository is for data access layer, that is where you want to connect to a database. For example, giving a call to a table where you're going to fetch all the employees. That class which gives a call to ORM with the help of ORM framework, give a call to database layer, is going to be marked with @repository annotation. But all of the three are going to create nothing but the beans, which you can easily embed in any of the class and use it explicitly. What is the difference between auto-wired and construction injection? Auto-wiring is like this. If you remember in the previous, if you use @auto-wire here, then you would not have need the construction injection like this. So that is auto-wire. That is a field injection. So auto-wire is a field injection. It is not a recommended way, and it is very difficult to hard and test and maintain. The second one that I have shown you here in an example is the recommended way of embedding the repository dependency in your service layer, so that you can give a call to service layer's repository internally. Now you can easily give a call to the database layer, fetch all the user details from the user repository with the help of user service. So it's the recommended way. It has the immutable dependencies. It is better for testability and maintainability. What are starters in Spring Boot? Starters are nothing but the bundle of dependencies. For example, if you add Spring Boot Starter Web, it automatically gets all the classes which is needed to make your application a web application. If you add Data JPA, the responsibility of this is to add all the classes, enums, constants, and everything which is basically needed to create the ORM framework interaction from your application to the database layer. If you add the security, this is bundle of all the classes, the login page, the logout page, authentication, authorization, filters, everything is added as a bundled package to you. Just add one dependency and you will get out of box all of these features and facilities automatically. So it simplifies the dependency management and also makes sure they are having the compatible versions. Because there might be the case that if you add one of the dependencies and after some time its version is upgraded, then will you keep on going and updating each and every jar in your application? Answer is no. Just add the dependencies, all the jars needed for that particular related module or component will be automatically upgraded. All of them. You don't have to do it one by one upgrade of jars. What is the purpose of application.properties and application.yaml? This is a very important question. Both of these are for external configuration files. That means when you want to customize the default properties set by Spring Boot. That is where you use the external configuration files. And these two files are an example of the place where you can override the default properties. For example, always the server port for Tomcat is 8080. If you want to override that, you have to add that in your either properties file or YAML file. So it stores environment specific settings. It is used for database configuration, server configurations, login, and adding custom properties. How do you define your custom properties? Because server.port is something which is an existing property which you have overridden from 8080 to 8081. But if I want to use my own code.decode equals to new name, then how would you define those custom properties? So that is where you add your properties to YAML or properties file. And how do you use it? If it is only one value, you can use with @ value. But if there are 10 different properties inside the bigger name called as app, then you can use configuration properties. It is going to help you configure multiple properties under one single name. Now, what is component scanning? Component scanning is the process of automatically discovering beans. Scans all the root and the child packages for these annotations. And whenever it finds these annotations, it automatically creates the bean out of them and add it to IOC container to manage them. The annotations are component, service, repository, controller, and even the beans. How does Spring Boot creates and manages the bean? The Spring Boot, first of all, scans the root class where @Spring Boot annotation is there. Then it searches all the child classes. So it just do the quick scanning. It finds all the classes which are annotated by these annotations. Then registers those bean definitions and create the bean and container. Then whenever you need those beans, it injects those dependencies into the required classes. For example, your controller needs service. So your service is injected from IOC containers managed bean into your controller layer. And all the bean lifecycle management is also done by IOC container for you. What is bean lifecycle? A bean lifecycle is a sequence of steps that a Spring Bean goes through from creation to destruction inside the IOC container. What are those steps? First of all, bean is initialized. If you remember in the previous pointers, I have said that there's a component scan happening. That component scan is responsible for creating beans in the IOC container. Then whenever you need those beans, for example, your service is required inside the controller bean and your repository bean is required inside the service bean. That is where dependency injection happens. Then Spring invokes post construction after property set and init methods, and then when the bean is ready to be used, it can be available to any applications, any bean, and it is freely usable. And at the end, when you don't need it, the destruction is there. That is also done by this. So @pre-destroy and custom destroy methods are there, which helps the beans destruction in the IOC container. This is rarely done. We mostly use the post construct, that is the after bean initialization part. So bean initialization lifecycle consists of instantiation, dependency injection, the initialization, the use of it in the required classes, and destruction of those beans inside the IOC container. What is the difference between singleton and prototype scope? The singleton is a default scope. The one instance per container is there and is shared across all the application. So if two classes uses the same bean and there is some name for that employee. So for example, there is an employee class which is of the singleton scope and the employee has name, address, and all those stuff. If I have by mistake updated the name from John to Smith, then all the classes using those particular employee bean is going to see the updated change, and that is the default condition that all the instances per container has the singleton scoped bean. Then it will be shared across all the classes of the application. Second is a prototype scope where each instance is created for a new request and Spring does not manage the destruction. It's the garbage collector who has to do it. So what are the different types of bean scopes available in Spring? As discussed, singleton, which is one bean per container. This is where interviewer traps you. It will ask you what is the difference between singleton in Java and singleton in Spring. Singleton in Java means one instance per JVM. But singleton in Spring means one instance per container, Spring IOC container. So suppose you have two containers in your application, then you still might have two instances, one registered in one container, another registered with another container. So that is the break of the Java singleton pattern, because here the singleton is one per container and there can be multiple containers in one application, JVM. Second is a prototype where new bean is created. The request, that is one bean is created for per HTTP request, a session where one instance per HTTP session is created and shared across the whole session. Application is one bean per servlet context, and WebSocket is one instance per WebSocket session. Remember, the prototype does not mean if you inject the prototype bean in singleton, it will still remain the singleton, because singleton does not allow new bean creation. It is a deep copy, it is not a shallow copy. How do you exclude the auto configuration? This is how in the Spring Boot application you can exclude your auto configuration classes. How does the Spring Boot handles dependency management? It is done through BOM, that is bill of materials. That is, suppose you add this parent dependency. Then it is a task of Spring to automatically manage the compatible library versions automatically. You do not have to add any version tag in any of your dependency. It will be handled by your parent. So it is better version control, it reduces the conflicts, and it is easier to upgrade. Now next is, what are Spring profiles? It is used to separate environment specific configurations. The common profiles are dev, test, and prod. For example, a profile is dev, then this particular bean is going to be used, the dev email service is going to be used for dev environment. How do you activate such profiles? There are three ways to do it. You can do it in application properties with Spring profiles.active equals to dev, or you can do it with a command line with -- Spring profiles active as dev, or last one is an environment variable. What is the difference between dev YAML and prod YAML? Both of them are the external configuration files, but dev is usually used in development environments, while prod is for production environment. Here usually we have the debugging log enabled, while in the prod we have usually the error or the warning enabled. The local database configurations are done in dev, while the production database configuration in prod. It is user-friendly settings in dev and less restrictive. So, and opposite is of prod. So application YAML contains the most common configurations of both of them, and it is a default fallback. The profile specific are these, which overrides the specific active profiles. How do you inject configuration values using @value? Suppose your property is app.name is my app. Then injection has two options. Either if it is only a single value to be injected, you can use @value and inject the single property like this. But if that is a nested property under a same common name, say a base property, say for example the base name is app, then it has name, timeout, request parameters, and all those stuff, then you can inject that using @configuration properties like this, where you can prefix it with app, and then you can have multiple variables with name, timeout, and that will be automatically bounded with the specific variable names. So what is configuration property? It is going to map multiple properties to a POJO. It supports hierarchical configuration and type safety. For example, your app has name, version, timeout. Then you can create the app as the configuration prefix, and then you can have the name, the version, the timeout as the POJO, and then it will automatically map my app name to the name and 1.0 to the version automatically. So when you have a single property to be injected inside your class, you can use @value. If you have multiple properties inside one common base name, for example app, then you can use configuration properties. It will map all your variables with the properties inside that common prefix. Why is configuration property preferred over value? Because value is good for only single property, but not for multiple nested properties. It is not type safe and it is difficult for many properties, while configuration properties is type safe, clearer code, support nested properties, and it is easier to maintain. For example, it is preferred for larger configurations. How do you create a custom configuration class? You can use either @configuration, and you can create n number of beans. For example, a REST template bean, a web client bean. So wherever you need a legacy code, you can use REST template. Where you need a web client, you can create the bean and use web client. So it defines custom beans and replaces the XML old configuration done for the Spring configurations and Spring frameworks. How do you encrypt your sensitive properties? This is a very important interview question because many a times when you have the username, passwords, or client ID secrets to be added, you cannot add it to just your external properties like YAML file or property file. You have to have those sensitive properties properly encrypted. How would you do that? The common approach is either you can have that in environment variables, but it's not a scalable solution. Second option is a vaults, which is the best possible enterprise level solutions. You can use Azure Key Vault to store your secrets. You can use AWS Secret Manager to store your secrets. You can use HashiCorp and all those stuff. But never store your plain text secrets in your source code or external YAML files. How can externalized configuration be managed? External configurations can be managed through 5 different possibilities, and whatever possibility I'm going to tell is the highest priority and then lower. So if you add any of the configuration to your command line argument, that is the most highest priority. For example, you're going to run a jar, but you add the server port as 9090. This is the highest priority. If you now override that, in the environment variable, you can export the server property like this, but these two are not scalable solutions. The best possible ways is to use the YAML file, to use external config files, and to use default files. Now, how would you override the configuration properties in different environments? Now, suppose you have a property for my app dev for dev profile, my app prod for prod profile. Then you can create different property files and then activate the profile based on your requirement. The priority order will always be if this particular Spring profile is active or my app name is already given in command line, that will be taking preference from all of these 4. If you have a default application.yaml file or application.property file, that will be from the lowest priority. Then a specific file takes the priority and environment variables takes even more priority and command line takes the most priority. So always be very sure where you add your properties to. If you add it to your application property and if you want to override, you can use profile specific property. For example, application prod.property. If you want even to have the property which is specific to this environment, then use environment variables. And if you want to make the property very specific to one run, then you can use this way of adding the port to the run part. Now, next is MVC and REST related to Spring Boot applications queries. What is Spring MVC? Spring MVC is the MVC pattern of Spring's web framework. It is used to build web applications and REST APIs, and the components are MVC, that is model, view, and controller. Where a client gives a call to controller, controller gives a call to service, service gives a call to repository, repository gives a call to DB. What is the life cycle of a bean in a Spring MVC? A client sends the request, HTTP request, a DispatcherServlet receives the request, handles the mapping and finds the controller executes the method, the service layer is called, the database layer is called, the response is sent back to service layer, to controller layer, to DispatcherServlet, and then at the end to the client. Either it will be in the JSON or the MVC format. Now, what is the difference between REST controller and controller? A controller is for MVC, REST controller is for REST APIs. So it is used for MVC app, it is used for REST APIs. It returns the view, usually in HTML or something which is HTML text, which is visible and viewable by users, while REST controller uses JSON. It requires @response body, while @response body is not required, it is automatically added in the REST controller annotation itself. What is the difference between request param and path variable? 90% of people get confused between both of them. So there are 2 ways how you provide the ID detail example. There are 2 ways to provide ID details to your controller. Either you can provide the ID details in request parameter or you can provide directly in the path variable of the URL. So if you say, if this is the URL, say http://localhost 8080/users, where ID is 101. This is the query parameter. And how do you read the query parameter? You use @query param and map this ID exactly to the name of this. While when you have just the http localhost 8080/users/101, then this is a path variable which reads from the URL. So your get mapping will not just be /users, but will be /users/ID, where this ID is exactly the 101, which is added here. So now a variable to read this is going to be path variable and not the request param. So the 2 places where the changes is, firstly, it is key value pair in the request parameter, but no key in the URL. It's only the value which is appended to the URL, that is path variable. The way to read is also different. The get mapping is only still /users and all the request parameters are readed like this. While in the query parameters, the query becomes long with a /id added and appended to the get mapping or the post mapping itself. And the way to fetch that is with the path variable and the request parameter for the request parameter payload. What is response entity? The entire HTTP response is the response entity. So you can control the status code, headers, and body of the response whenever you use the response entity. And hence, it is very recommended way, if you're using the REST API, always send a response in the response entity, because that is where you can control what you're going to send the status as, you can what you're going to send in the body, and what you're going to send in the headers. How do you handle the exceptions globally? You can use it the editor controller advice on the class layer, which is a global exception handler for you, and all the methods to handle specific exceptions like user not found exception, illegal argument exceptions, null pointer exceptions. All those stuff can be handled using exception handler, which is a method level annotation. So the global exception handler is going to have two major annotations: a class level annotation, which is controller advice, and a method level annotation, which is exception handler, which handles your specific exceptions and also is able to handle multiple exceptions with the comma separated exceptions also. Now, what is controller advice? It is a global exception handler class. It applies to all the controllers and it tries to handle all your exceptions centrally with one single class. So your global exception handler is a one single place and a centralized place where all your exceptions are handled. It is annotated with @controller advice and all the methods will be @exception handler. How do you validate the request payload in the Spring Boot application? The beautiful way to do it is now with Spring Boot 3.x, it is with Jakarta validation and Hibernate validator. So Hibernate is a ORM framework which helps your entities map to database, and that is where your Jakarta and Hibernate validator comes into field. The validation rules are added to the DTOs using annotations like @not blank, email, @max, @min, and so on. And @valid is used in a controller to validate the user request, so that whenever if the request body comes in a JSON format, it is first mapped to this user DTO, and it first checks during deserialization from JSON to object itself. It checks whether name should not be null, the email should be a proper email with @xyz.com in that particular format. If none of this happens, the validation fails and Spring throws method argument not valid exception, because it is a method argument level validation done at the controller layer. So when you want to do the validation in Spring Boot, you usually play with the inbuilt methods first. It is given out of the box by Jakarta and Hibernate validator to you, and the two places where you want to change is at the DTO level and at the controller level, where @valid will validate the request and @not blank, email, max, min are all the things that you have to use over your DTOs. What is the purpose of @valid? @valid is the one who triggers the validation before the controller is executed. The validate request contains DTO fields and it throws validation exceptions if the rule fails. That I have already shown in the previous question. How do you customize the validation message? For example, you have the not the blank and @email and the format kind of stuff. But how do you want to have it more user friendly? Because it is going to throw an exception called as method argument not valid exception, which your user cannot understand. So how would you fix that issue? So you can give the user friendly messages like this in the bracket of the all the annotations which is provided out of the box by Hibernate validator or Jakarta validator to you. So how do you do it? @blank, name cannot be empty. @email, please enter the proper email in the format of xyz@gmail.com or so on. So this is how you can give the proper user-friendly messages. What are the HTTP status code you commonly use? We use 200 for OK, 201 for created, 204 for not content, no content found, 400 for bad request, 401 for unauthorized, 403 for forbidden. These are the security related ones. 404 for not found, 409 for conflict, and 500 for common internal server errors. How do you implement pagination and REST APIs? You can do it with a pageable, which is Spring's data's inbuilt library and class for you. So whenever you try to get the user, you can use pageable, and then you can use find all with pageable. Pageable automatically gives you the page and size as the default variables. You can say the page 0 size of 10, and then the next will be automatically with the page 1, again the size 10, and so on. And the sorting is also by default given on the top of all these page and size stuff, which is given by the pageable, which is a class and a library provided by Spring Data to you for pagination. Now, how do you version the REST APIs? There are 4 ways how you can manage the versions of REST API. For example, there was a V1 version where you give the response to the user with a list of users where there is only name and email address. But now there is a breaking change. Now your user does not have the email address, but rather have the name and the mobile number. Then this is a breaking change because now your clients will not have any email address or something. It will only have the name and mobile number. So this is how you version with V1 and V2, and your DTO also changes from V1 to V2 because initially it was name and email address. Now it is name and mobile number. It's a breaking change. If you try to do user list .get .stream and get for each user the email address, you will get null. So this is a breaking change. This is where you have to version your endpoints. The first way is this, where you use V1 and V2 in the REST endpoints. That is a URL versioning. Most common and 110% places you will use this. But some places you use request parameter versioning also. That is, in the parameters itself you say is version 1 or version 2 be used. The header version, where in the headers you send that API version 1 to be used, and then respond me with email address if 1 is used and mobile number if 2 is used. This 4th option is a content negotiation versioning. This is the least used one, where you say is V1 plus JSON, that is what is accepted. And in the get mapping also, you accept the V1 version of your user's endpoint. Which approach is best? The most common and the most used one is the URL versioning only, because it is easiest to route in API gateway, it is easiest to debug, document, and client adoption is also easy. So whenever the version is a breaking change, then only use the versioning, otherwise don't use it. Always make sure the backward compatibility has to be maintained wherever possible, otherwise it's okay. Avoid creating new version for small change and deprecate the old version gradually. So the versioning allows backward compatibility when API evolves. The common approach is URL versioning, header versioning, request versioning, content negotiation, but the URL versioning is the most common one. Now, how do you document the APIs using Swagger or OpenAPI? Now, OpenAPI is a API specification standard. The Swagger UI provides you an interactive UI to view and test your APIs, and Spring Boot commonly implemented using Spring Doc API, OpenAPI, which is a Swagger implementation. You add the dependency in the demo controller. What you do, @ operation gives you the summary of your API. The API response tells you this API might respond you with 200 if it is okay, 404 if user is not found, 409 if conflicting user is found, and so on. And to access that documentation, you can use localhost 8080 with Swagger UI HTML or the index HTML, and the versioning is done like this. The benefits of API documentation is that this Swagger automatically generates the API documentation for you. It is very good for testing, and other applications and other clients can just call your endpoints just by looking at the Swagger documentation. It does not come to you and ask you what is your endpoint available. It can just see all your endpoints registered here in Swagger. It generates OpenAPI specifications. It improves the discoverability by other clients and other service APIs. Contract is well defined and published in Swagger between frontend and backend and other teams. So OpenAPI or Swagger is automatically generative REST API documentation. In Spring Boot, it is commonly implemented using OpenAPI Spring Doc, which scans the controller annotation and exposes the documentation through Swagger UI. Now, there are a few questions on the Spring Data JPA, which is an ORM framework for Spring application. What is Spring Data JPA? The Spring modulet simplifies database access using JPA. It reduces the DO layer and provides a repository interface. It's basically nothing but the interfacing between your Java Spring Boot application and your database tables. There has to be one framework, which is usually the ORM framework. And JPA is the one interface which provides the ORM facility to you. It provides you the basic CRUD operations, pagination, sorting, and querying methods. What is the difference between JPA and Hibernate? JPA is just a specification with interface and APIs. Hibernate is a proper implementation with proper classes and frameworks which implements these interfaces. It is just the standard while it's an implementation of JPA. It is vendor independent while Hibernate is a Hibernate specific one. So what happens is your Spring Boot applications does not directly interact with databases, but it interacts with an interface first, which is JPA. And then through the classes, the implementation happens through Hibernate. What is entity in Data JPA? It is a bean which is managed by JPA. It is a Java class mapped to a database table. So basically, when your table is mapped to a particular class, that becomes an entity. It is actually going to represent a row in a particular table. And what are the entity states in the JPA? It is a transient state, which is created with a new object, which is not managed by JPA. A persistent state, which when you persist in the entity manager, that is a persisted state. A detached state, where you still exist the user in the database, but no longer in the managed entity state or the managed by JPA or Hibernate. And the removed state, which is marked for deletion. Now, what is the difference between save and save flush? Save is going to just save the entity, but the actual save to database is delayed until commit happens. While save and flush is the quick way to save and immediately flush or commit the changes to database. So save is a delayed, while flush is immediate flush. It is better for performance. It is used for DB when the update is needed instantly. Now, what is lazy loading? Lazy loading is where your data is loaded only when it is required. The default for one-to-many and many-to-many. For example, you have list of orders. Now, the orders are going to be fetched in a lazy way only if you want the variables of the list of order POJO. That is, suppose you want the order ID. Then only it is going to be fetched from database until unless it is lazy proxy returned by a Hibernate framework to you. This is good for performance and reduces unnecessary queries. What is eager loading? The related data is loaded immediately. That is the eager loading. For example, when you try to fetch the department, that is where all the department data is coming into your department object then and there. So it loads unnecessary data. Now, because of this lazy loading, the problem comes, which is n+1 problem. What is n+1 query problem? It occurs when an application executes one query to fetch the parent and an additional query to fetch all the children. For example, there are list of users. So when you do select star from user, it is going to supposed to return 100 users. Now, when you try to access the orders for each user, what you do for each order, get the orders. So what you do, you select star from orders where user ID is 1, 2, 3 and so on 100. So one query was to fetch all the users and the 100 queries to fetch all the orders for all the users. So total 101 query. This is n+1 problem. Why this is bad? Because it increases the latencies, higher DB load, poor scalability. If there are 10 users, 11 queries, 100 users, 101 queries, 1000 users, 101 queries. How do you solve this n+1 problem? There are 4 ways to solve this. The fetch join, which is the most common one. That is when you try to fetch user with their order details from the orders column of that particular user. So this is going to find all the users with their order details. So the generated query will be select star from users, join on the table orders where user ID equals to order key user ID. So only one query is going to fix your n+1 problem. The second option is entity graph, which allows you to specify which related entity should be fetched eagerly, and rest all can still be the lazy loaded. So if all the users are going to be fetched lazily and only the orders for that particular user has to be fetched and other stuff can still remain the delayed or the lazy loaded, that you can define with the attribute path of orders. So only the orders is going to be fetched eagerly for all the users, and other stuff, for example, their department, their recommendations and all those still remains lazy loaded. Only orders comes eagerly. The third option is DTO projection, which is a technique where JPA fetch only required columns from the database and directly map to DTO instead of loading the entire entity in the DTO. So you are going to select the user DTO with only the name, ID and the order number. That's it. And only that required data is added to user DTO and other field remains empty or null. So this is the DTO projection, which is used to fetch only the required fields, which increases performance really nicely. The fourth and the last one is batch fetching, which is the way to reduce n+1 problem by loading multiple associations in batch instead of one query per entity. For example, when you had one query for fetching all the users, 100 users, then you have 100 queries to fetch from the orders table where user ID is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So 101 queries. With the batch fetching, what happens? When you say is batch size of 20, now it will say select star from orders where user ID is in 1, 2, 3 until 20, with 21 to 40 and 41 to 60, 61 to 80, 81 to 100. So total of 5 queries for select star from orders and only 1 query for users. So now total only 6 queries, which is much better than 101 query. So this is how it will prevent your n+1 queries load to only 6 queries with batch processing or batch fetching. Now, a very common question, that is lazy loading the cause of n+1? It's not true. Lazy loading is fine, but the issue is occurring when the lazy loaded associations are accessed repeatedly inside the loop. For 100 users, you are trying to fetch the order details of all those 100 people. That is where the problem lies. Lazy loading is not the problem. The looping of child and parent association is a problem. Now, a very important question. What is the difference between find by ID and find reference by ID or get reference by ID? So it will seem something very similar to easy loaded and lazy loaded, but easy and lazy loading is on the whole POJO or DTO level. But when you only want to find one user, then you say repository.find by ID and you will get one user. So it will immediately hit the database and return one entity for that particular ID. But if you want proxy, which is very similar to, you get the proxy in Hibernate for the complete POJO, here you can get one small proxy for one object of the database. That is the reference by ID. So this is going to return a proxy object, and database hit again occurs only and only when you try to do user.getID or user.getEmail address or try to fetch the internal details. Then the database hit happens and the returns response from there. So find by ID is an immediate query executed, while reference by ID is a lazy proxy. Find by ID returns you optional, while the reference by ID gives you an entity. This is safer and is faster only if reference is needed. Now, what is JPQL and native query and what is the difference? JPQL is Java Persistence Query Language. It works on entities, while the native query works on database tables like this. So it is a direct table interaction, while here you work with the entities. So here you see the user is an entity, while the users is the table. So when you work with the entities, that is the JPQL. When you work with the table names, that is native queries. JPQL is entity based, native query is table based, it is portable, it is DB specific. JPQL is recommended, while the native queries is only when the queries are very complex. Now, what is criteria query? It is a dynamic query builder. The where conditions when you get from request, that is where you append it, and the where query, the fields of the user, that is how you create a criteria query. So it is for dynamic query but compile time checked and no string concatenation. It is only where you have to filter out with where clause, that is where you use the criteria APIs. How does transaction works in Spring Boot? So when you have a transaction, you start a transaction, you execute multiple queries, you commit. But if an exception happens, you roll back. That is a transaction in JPA or Hibernate. So it is usually managed by transaction manager with @transaction annotation. What is a transaction annotation? Which defines the boundaries in Spring Boot. It automatically commits and rollback whenever an exception occurs. It is a rollback, otherwise it is commit. So whenever you have a user service, you try to create an order, you call the repository, then you add the user to the database. If any exception occurs or runtime occurs, automatical rollback happens. If no exception occurs, automatic commit happens. And this is because transactional usage over the method. It can be done at the class level also. What are transaction propagation level? There are total 5 propagation levels. The required is the default one. That is, if there is an existing transaction, it joins the transaction. If there is no transaction, it creates a new transaction and make the transaction properly in the boundary of transaction where commit and rollback can happen. Requires new is where a new transaction is created every time a new request comes. The support is the existing transaction. If it is available, uses that. Otherwise, it's okay. It does not create new one. It supports if transaction is there, I'm going to use it. If there is no transaction already, it's okay. I don't use it. The not supporters is where no transaction is required. This is rarely used. Mandatory is where transaction is already required pre-existingly. It does not create new if not there. And never is, it throws exception when transaction exists, which is also very, very rare. The nested is where you can create nested exceptions with the proper save points. Now let's come to the security section part of it. What is a Spring Security? It is a framework to provide you authentication, authorization, CSRF protection, session management, and password encryption. It is added with a Spring Security dependency. Can you explain the security filter chain? So whenever a request comes, there's an authentication filter, authorization filter, and then comes the controller. The common authentication filters are username, password authentication, basic authentication, JWT authentication, and so on, which validates your identity, checks for permissions, and blocks your unauthenticated and unauthorized access. What is authentication? It is providing the verification to the user. That is, your authentication can be done using your username, password, which tells you who you are. Example, the login form, the token validation, auth login, and so on. What is authorization? It determines what you are allowed to do. So if you have a role of admin, then only you are allowed to delete the user. So these are based on roles. Now, what is difference between JWT and session-based authentication? The very important difference is stateful is the session-based, stateless is JWT. That means no memory is needed for JWT, but server needs to maintain a session for session-based authentication. JWT is token-based, while session stored on server in session-based. JWT is scalable, session-based is less scalable. JWTs are very common in REST APIs, but session-based is common in MVCs. So the JWT flows goes like whenever you log in, a JWT is generated, a client stores a token, and token is sent in every request. But in the session flow, when you do the login, a session is created on the server. The session ID is stored in the cookie, and server validates those sessions with those cookies. Now, how do you implement the JWT authentication? For authentication, you need a user login. Onto that user login, you verify your credentials. Then you generate the token. Usually this authentication not authenticate. Usually this is also done by your authorization server, who generates the token and gives you the token. The client uses this token and hits the server. So whenever a login request comes, the authentication manager authenticates, validates your username, password, generates the token. The authentication server or authorization server gives you the JWT token, which is given to the client, which stores the token and sends it to the server, which validates the token and gives you the proper entry point to the controller. Now, what is Auth 2.0 in security? Auth 2.0 is an authorization framework. Remember, this is authorization framework to allow the access to the resources when and where it is really authorized to. So what Auth 2 does, whenever application comes, the user is redirected to authorization server. The user then logs in. Authorization server issues the token, and then application uses that user token to use the resources which it is allowed to. The Auth 2 roles are resource owner, which is the user, the client, which gives a request, application request, the authorization server, which issues the token, the resource server, which protects the resources. The Auth 2 flows is user gives a call to client application, then to authorization server, provides you the authorization code and the access token, and that access token you provide it to resource server. So user clicks the login with Google. The Google is the authorization server. It redirects you to the authorization server. User adds the username password to the authorization server. It returns you the authorization code. This is only and only with the authorization code grant type PXE. Then for that exchange of authorization code, you get the token, and that token is used to call all your APIs. Now, what is OIDC? OIDC is built on top of Auth 2, which provides authentication information or the user information. So it gives you the user email, name, subject, and all so on. The examples is Google, Okta, Keycloak, all of these also provide OIDC for you. Now, how do you secure your REST APIs? You can use HTTPS to provide extra security over the normal HTTP. You can use token for authentication and authorization part for the security of your REST APIs. You can use authorization with the @pre-authorize. You can use @valid to validate all your inputs. You can use encryptions. You can disable the unused endpoints. You can use rate limiting to prevent unusual traffic on your REST APIs. Now, what is the security best practices followed in Spring Boot? That is, you use Auth 2 and JWT. Never store your passwords. Use the proper security encoders. Use HTTPS and TSLs. Use authorizations with RBAC. Use exception handling. Store the secrets in your key vaults. Use proper security headers. Keep the dependencies updated and do proper monitoring and logging. What is the difference between unit testing and integration testing? Unit test the single class or method, while the integration tests multiple components together. Unit tests only that component. All the other components and dependencies are mocked, while in the integration test, the real dependencies are used. In unit test, it is a faster execution. The integration test, like for example, a Cucumber test is much more slower because it goes and spans across multiple components. For unit test, you don't need a Spring context, but for integration test, a Spring context is often loaded. Unit test focuses on business logic while integration test focuses on system behavior. The example of unit test in Spring Boot is it extends the mockito and then it mocks the user repository while it inject mocks the user service. This is a very important question. What do you mock? What do you inject mock? The thing that you want to test is inject mocked, and what you want to mock or not run is what is mocked. While the integration test is @ Spring Boot test. What is @ Spring Boot test? It loads the complete Spring application context, which is used for integration testing. And this test interacts between multiple layers. So it loads all the beans, supports embedded servers, and do end-to-end testing. Now, what is MVC, web MVC test? It is only for the MVC components. It is used to test only the controllers and do not load service repositories beans automatically. It is specifically used, web MVC test is specifically used for controllers. It is much more faster than Spring Boot test, but it focuses only on the controller testing. That is why it is not widely used. What is @ Data JPA test? It is specifically for repository testing. Just like it was for controller testing, now this is specifically for database testing. It loads only JPA-related components, uses in-memory H2DB. And the good thing is here entity manager is available, transactions is available, and faster database testing happens here. How do you mock dependencies using Mockito? So you use @ mock, you inject mock what you want to test, and then you use whenever this kind of mocking happens, when this happens, or return this. So this is mocking. When this happens, do not give a real call to repo rather than return optional of users. And then you verify it. For example, whenever this happens, return the list of users and verify it is being called. Now, what is mock MVC? It is a test utility for testing controllers. It simulates the HTTP request without starting any Tomcat or web server. It is faster execution, no embedded server needed. Test request response behavior is done through it. How do you test the REST APIs? You can use mock MVCs for REST APIs, or you can use Mockito also. What is test container and why is it useful? The test container is actually the real Docker containers during the test environment, which provides the production-like environment so that nothing fails in production. So here, if there is a user repository test, you make it as a test container, and in the container, you run the Postgre container, which is where the real database testing happens. No dependency on local setup, consistent test environment, and supports multiple DBs. Otherwise, what happens without test container is on the developer machine, different DB version, test might fail. But with the test container in the production-like environment, the same environment happens as the production in the Docker container, and hence the tests are reliable. Now let's go to the performance and monitoring and observability kind of stuff. What is Spring Boot Actuator? It is actually the one which provides a production-ready monitoring and management module. It provides health endpoint matrices, infos, environment properties, dumps, etc. What are the commonly used actuator endpoints? Info is for app information, health is for application health, matrices is for matrices, Prometheus and Grafana as expected for the logging matrices, the env for environment properties. This is for all the beans being created. The mapping is for request mappings. Logger is for logger configuration, thread dump, and heap dump. If you give a call to an actuator endpoint of health, it will say health is up. This is how you use the actuator endpoint. How do you monitor the health of an application? Through the actuator health. The health indicators indicate the database, disk space, Redis, RabbitMQs, custom indicators. How do you create your own custom indicator? You can create a custom indicator like this, which implements the health indicator and then returns you the upbuild. This is used by Kubernetes probes, load balancers, and monitoring tools. Now, what are micrometer matrices? Micrometer matrices are used by Spring Boot to collect the application and JVM matrices to integrate with multiple monitoring systems like Grafana, Prometheus, Micrometer, and so on. It is usually used to monitor the CPU usage, memory usage, request counts, and request time. This is how you add the dependency. You add the custom matrices like this, and this actually supports you to have a vendor neutral APIs, which supports many integration with support tools like Prometheus, Grafana, Micrometer, and so on. How do you integrate with Prometheus and Grafana? There is a dependency available for Prometheus. You expose the endpoints, like you want only health, info, matrices, and Prometheus endpoints to be used for actuator, and then you use and access this endpoint with actuators at Prometheus. You set up some configurations in your application.yaml or property file. You connect your Grafana, which is actually nothing but the UI for your Prometheus, where you will see all the dashboard and all your logs will be visible in the dashboard, Grafana dashboard, which helps you with the real-time monitoring, alerts, dashboard, and performance analytics. Now, last thing, how do you implement distributed tracing using OpenTelemetry? So first, what is distributed tracing? It is the request going from one service to another service to third service and so on. The request not only stays in one Spring Boot application but goes across multiple Spring Boot application. So here every request gets the trace ID and each application gets the span ID. So the whole request is having one unique trace ID, but n services will have n different span IDs. So how do you add it? You add the dependency, you configure the properties, you export the traces using Zipkins or Grafana, and basically the trace ID is one which completes the whole request journey from first point, starting from gateway to the end of the all the different microservices. Span ID is a single operation done in one single individual microservice. Trace ID is unique identifier for the request. Span ID is unique identifier for one application. So suppose there is a request going from API gateway to user service to the creating of order and taking the payment. Then trace ID will be unique and same for all the four microservices, but span ID will be span 1, 2, 3, and 4. That is different for each microservice. So that's how you do the OpenTelemetry distributed tracing with microservices and Spring Boot.